The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and regret. And I couldn't look away from his eyes, those damn eyes that held a storm I wasn't ready to weather. At 40, I'd seen my share of pain. But nothing prepared me for the way Ethan's trembling hand brushed mine. A fleeting touch that burned like a confession. I was his doctor, his anchor in this sterile hell. Yet that moment shattered every boundary I'd sworn to uphold. My name is Dr. Michael Harper, a cardiologist at St. Luke's Hospital in Seattle, where the rain never stops and neither does the grind. For 20 years, I'd built a life on precision diagnoses, surgeries, clear lines between me and my patients. Ethan Caldwell, 20, with a heart condition that kept him tethered to monitors and 4 drips. Wasn't supposed to change that. He was just another case, another chart. But the way he looked at me, like I was more than a white coat, started unraveling something I'd buried long ago. It was late. The kind of late where the hospital hums with a quiet that feels alive. I was checking Ethan's chart. The usual routine congenital heart defect. Surgery scheduled in 3 days. Odds better than most. He'd been here for weeks. His body frail, but his spirit anything but. He had this laugh, sharp and bright, that cut through the monotony of my rounds. That night, he was awake, propped up on pillows, his dark hair falling into his eyes. "You ever get tired of saving people, Doc?" he asked, his voice soft but piercing. I smirked, keeping it professional. "It's the job, Ethan. You don't get to pick and choose who you save." But he didn't laugh like he usually did. Instead, he reached out, his fingers grazing mine as I adjusted his 4. It wasn't an accident. His touch lingered, warm and deliberate, and my breath caught in a way that felt like betrayal. I pulled back, my heart hammering. "Ethan, we can't," I started. But his eyes stopped me cold. They weren't the eyes of a kid. They were searching, desperate, like he was reaching for something bigger than both of us. "I'm sorry," he whispered. But he didn't look sorry. He looked like he'd just thrown a match into a room full of gasoline. I should have walked out. I should have reported it, reassigned his case, done anything to keep the line between us intact. But I didn't. I stood there, frozen, as the weight of his touch settled into my bones. I'd spent years hiding who I was closeted, married to my work, telling myself it was enough. Ethan's touch wasn't just a breach of ethics. It was a mirror, forcing me to face the parts of myself I'd locked away. The next day, I avoided his room. I buried myself in charts, surgeries, anything to keep my mind off him. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, felt the ghost of his fingers. My colleagues noticed. "You okay, Mike?" Dr. Sarah and Gwen asked over coffee in the break room. I nodded, lying through my teeth. I wasn't okay. I was spiraling. By evening, I couldn't avoid it anymore. Ethan's surgery was too close, and I had to check on him. When I walked into his room, he was sketching in a journal, his hands steady despite the 4 in his arm. "You didn't come by this morning," he said, not looking up. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like he was testing me. "I was busy." I lied again. He set the journal down, and I saw a drawing of a heart. Not the anatomical kind, but one split down the middle, jagged and raw. "You ever feel like you're running out of time?" he asked, his eyes locking onto mine. I wanted to say no, to keep it clinical, but the truth clawed its way out. "Every day," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. And just like that, the line I'd drawn between us blurred a little more. That night, I sat in my office, staring at the rain streaking down the window. Ethan wasn't just a patient anymore. He was a question I didn't know how to answer, a risk I wasn't sure I could take. But the surgery was coming. And with it, the chance that I'd lose him before I even figured out what this was. I didn't know then that this was only the beginning, that Ethan's touch would unravel my life in ways I never imagined. The hospital felt like a pressure cooker, each beep of a monitor ticking down to Ethan's surgery. I'd always prided myself on keeping my emotions in check. But now they were a tangled mess, knotted around a 20-year-old kid who'd somehow slipped past my defenses. Every time I passed his room, my chest tightened, like my own heart was betraying me. I tried to focus on the routine rounds, consults, the endless paperwork that kept street loops running. But Ethan's presence was a pulse I couldn't ignore. His chart said he was stable, but nothing about him felt stable. Not his crooked smile. Not the way he'd catch my eye and hold it just a second too long. I told myself it was the stress of his condition, the fear of the scalpel, making him reach out. But deep down, I knew better. That afternoon, I found him in the hospital's small courtyard, a rare break from the sterile wards. He was bundled in a hoodie, sitting on a bench under a gray Seattle sky, sketching again. I shouldn't have stopped, but my feet betrayed me. "You're supposed to be resting," I said, keeping my tone light but firm. He looked up, his green eyes catching the dull light. "Can't rest when my head's a mess, Doc." He patted the bench beside him, an invitation I knew I should refuse. I sat anyway, leaving a careful distance between us. The air smelled of damp grass and impending rain. And for a moment, we just sat there, two people pretending the world wasn't watching. "You ever think about what you'd do if you only had a year left?" he asked, his voice low, like he was sharing a secret. I wanted to deflect, to keep it clinical, but his question hit too close to home. I'd spent my life avoiding questions like that, burying myself in work to drown out the what-ifs. "I'd probably keep doing what I'm doing," I said, hating how hollow it sounded. "Saving people like you." He laughed, but it was sharp, bitter. "You don't save people, Mike. You fix their hearts. Big difference." He closed his sketchbook, and I caught a glimpse of another drawing, a man's silhouette. Faceless but familiar. My pulse spiked. Was it me? I didn't ask. I couldn't. Instead, I changed the subject. "You scared about the surgery?" It was a safe question, one I'd asked 100 patients before. But Ethan wasn't 100 patients. He leaned closer, his shoulder brushing mine, and I didn't pull away. "Scared I won't wake up," he said. "Scared I'll wake up and still feel empty." His voice cracked, and I saw the weight of a life lived in hospital beds, of a heart that might give out before he ever got to live. I wanted to reach for him, to tell him he wasn't alone. But my hands stayed glued to my sides. "You're not empty, Ethan," I said, my voice softer than I meant. "You're the least empty person I've ever met." It was true. His laugh, his sketches, the way he saw through my carefully built wall, she was alive in a way I hadn't been in years. He turned to me, his face inches from mine, and for a moment, I thought he might close the gap. I wanted him to. God help me. I wanted it. But a nurse called my name from across the courtyard, and the spell broke. I stood, my heart pounding, and muttered something about rounds. Ethan just nodded, his eyes saying what his lips didn't. Back in my office, I tried to bury myself in work again, but my mind kept drifting to him. I pulled up his chart, staring at the cold facts. 20 years old, aortic stenosis, high-risk procedure. But he wasn't just data. He was Ethan, who drew broken hearts and asked questions that cut too deep. I was his doctor, but I was also a man who'd spent years denying who I was. And now, at 40, I was running out of excuses. That night, I went home to my empty apartment, the rain drumming against the windows. I poured a whiskey and stared at a photo on my shelf. Younger, smiling with colleagues at a conference. I looked happy, but I wasn't. I'd known I was gay since I was a teenager, but I'd buried it under ambition, fear, the need to fit in. Ethan's touch had cracked that facade, and I didn't know how to put it back together. The next day, I found a note slipped under my office door. Ethan's handwriting. Messy but deliberate. I'm not sorry. Are you? I folded it, tucked it into my pocket, and felt the weight of it all day. I wasn't sorry either. And that was the problem. The note burned a hole in my pocket. Ethan's words looping in my head like a heartbeat I couldn't silence. I'm not sorry. Are you? I avoided his room all morning, telling myself it was for his sake. For mine. For the sake of the rules I was dangerously close to breaking. But by noon, I couldn't stay away. His room was quiet when I entered, the monitors casting a soft glow over his face. He was reading, a worn paperback of The Catcher in the Rye, and the sight of it made my chest ache. Good book, I said, trying to keep it light. He looked up, his smile small but knowing. You read it, Doc. Or you just say that to all your patients. There was a tease in his voice, but his eyes were serious, searching mine for something I wasn't sure I could give. I read it, I said, sitting in the chair by his bed. Back when I was your age. Made me want to run away and never look back. I didn't know why I said it, but it felt like a confession, like I was offering him a piece of me in return for his note. Ethan set the book down, his fingers tracing the cover. I used to think about running away, he said. Before all this. He gestured at the four. The monitors. Now I just want to stay alive long enough to figure out who I am. His words hit like a punch. I wanted to tell him he had time, that he'd make it through the surgery. But the truth was, I couldn't promise that. Instead, I said, you're already more you than most people ever get to be. He laughed, soft and sad. You're good at that. You know, making me feel like I'm not just a broken machine. His hand moved, resting closer to mine on the bed. Not touching, but close enough to feel the heat of his skin. I didn't move away. We talked for a while about books, music, the way Seattle's rain made everything feel heavier. It was easy, too easy, to forget I was his doctor. But then he asked, you ever been in love, Mike? And the air changed, charged with something dangerous. I hesitated, my throat tight. Once, I said finally. Didn't end well. It was the truth. But I didn't tell him the whole story, how I'd loved a man in med school, how I'd pushed him away because I was too scared to face myself. Ethan didn't push, but his eyes said he knew there was more. The rest of the day was a blur of surgeries and consults. But Ethan's question stayed with me. Love. I hadn't let myself think about it in years. But now it was all I could think about. That night, I found myself back in his room, even though I had no reason to be there. He was asleep, his chest rising and falling under the thin hospital blanket. I watched him for too long, then left before I did something stupid. The next morning, Sarah cornered me in the break room. You're spending a lot of time with that Caldwell kid, she said, her tone careful but pointed. Everything okay? I nodded, but my stomach twisted. Sarah wasn't stupid. She'd seen the way I looked at him, the way I lingered, just making sure he's ready for surgery. I said, but even I didn't believe it. That afternoon, Ethan was worse. His vitals were slipping, and we had to move the surgery up. The news hit me like a freight train. I found him in his room, staring out the window, his face pale. Tomorrow, he said when I walked in, his voice flat. They told me. I sat beside him, closer than I should have. You're strong, Ethan. You'll get through this. But my voice shook. and he noticed. "You're scared too," he said, turning to me. His hand found mine, and this time, I didn't pull away. His fingers laced through mine, and for a moment, the world was just us 12 people, terrified and alive, holding on to something neither of us could name. I admitted, my voice barely audible. But not just for the surgery. It was the closest I'd come to saying it out loud, and it felt like stepping off a cliff. Ethan squeezed my hand, his eyes fierce. "If I make it through this, promise me we'll talk. Really talk." I nodded, unable to speak, because I knew that promise could cost me everything. The morning of Ethan's surgery, the hospital felt like a battlefield, all sharp edges and sterile calm masking the chaos underneath. I stood outside the OR, scrubbing in, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind screamed. Ethan's face pale, determined, those green eyes burning with hope and fear haunted me. I wasn't his surgeon. That was Dr. Patel, the best in the state. But I'd insisted on being in the room. Professional duty, I told myself. But it was more than that. I needed to see him through this, to know he'd come out the other side. The OR was a blur of green gowns and bright lights. Ethan's small frame dwarfed by the machines keeping him alive. I stood by the monitors, my heart in my throat. As Patel's team worked with precision I'd always admired but now resented for its coldness. Hours dragged like years. Every beep of the monitor was a lifeline. Every dip in his vitals a knife to my chest. I caught Patel's eye once, and he gave me a nod steady. Professional, but it didn't ease the panic clawing at me. When they finally closed him up, Patel said, "He's stable. Good work, team." But I didn't feel relief. I felt hollow, like I'd left something vital in that room. In recovery, Ethan was out cold, tubes and wires snaking around him like a cruel reminder of how fragile he was. I sat by his bed, ignoring the nurses' curious glances. My hand hovered over his, but I didn't touch him. Not here. Not now. Instead, I whispered, "You did it. Ethan, you're still here." My voice cracked, and I hated how much I needed him to wake up. He didn't stir for hours. I stayed, telling myself it was just until he was stable. But the truth was, I couldn't leave. When his eyes finally fluttered open, groggy and unfocused, I felt like I could breathe again. "Hey," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "You kept your promise." I smiled, though it felt like a lie. "Told you I would." But the weight of his words from before the surgery promise me will talk hung between us, heavy and unspoken. The next few days were a tightrope walk. Ethan was recovering, but slowly, his body fighting to catch up with his will. I kept my visits brief, professional, but every time I left his room, I felt like I was leaving a piece of myself behind. Sarah pulled me aside again, her eyes sharp. "Mike, you need to be careful. People are talking." "Let them talk," I snapped, then regretted it. She was right. The hospital was a fishbowl, and I was swimming too close to the glass. But I couldn't stop. Ethan was awake now, more alive with every day, and his presence was like a drug I didn't want to quit. One night, when the ward was quiet, he caught my hand as I adjusted his chart. "You're avoiding me," he said, his voice stronger now, cutting through the fog of my excuses. "I'm not." I lied, but my eyes betrayed me. He held my gaze, and for a moment, I saw everything as fear, his hope, the way he looked at me like I was his lifeline. "Ethan, it's complicated." "Then uncomplicate it," he said, his fingers tightening around mine. "I'm not a kid. Mike, I know what I feel." His words were a challenge, a dare, and I wanted to take it. But the weight of my job, my past, The rules I'd sworn to follow, they were chains I couldn't break. I pulled my hand away, my chest aching. Get some rest, I said, and walked out before I said something I couldn't take back. But as I stood in the hallway, my back against the wall, I knew I was running out of places to hide. Ethan wasn't just a patient anymore, and I wasn't just a doctor. We were two people caught in something bigger than both of us. And the surgery hadn't fixed that, it had only made it more real. The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzed like a warning, but I ignored them, drawn back to Ethan's room like a moth to a flame. He was sitting up now, his color better, his smile brighter, but his eyes still carried that weight, like he knew we were running out of time to face whatever this was. I'd spent my life avoiding risks like this, but Ethan was rewriting the rules, and I was letting him. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," he said when I walked in, his voice teasing but soft. He was right. I hadn't. Not since his surgery. Not since his hand in mine had made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. "I'm fine," I said, checking his chart to avoid his gaze. But he wasn't letting me off that easy. He reached out, his fingers brushing my wrist, and I froze. "Ethan," I warned, but my voice lacked conviction. "Talk to me, Mike," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "You promised." That promise again. The one I'd made in a moment of weakness. Now a tether pulling me closer to the edge. I sat down, the chair creaking under me. "This can't happen," I said, forcing the words out. "I'm your doctor. I'm twice your age. There are rules." "Screw the rules," he cut in, his voice sharp. "I'm not just your patient, and you know it." His eyes were fierce, unyielding, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. He was right, and that was the problem. I'd crossed a line the moment I let his touch linger. The moment I let myself feel something I'd buried for years. I ran a hand through my hair, my resolve crumbling. "You don't understand, Ethan. If anyone finds out if I let this happen, I could lose everything. My job, my license, I trailed off. Because the truth was, I was more afraid of losing him than any of that. He leaned forward, wincing slightly from the effort. "I'm not asking you to throw it all away. I'm just asking you to be honest. With me. With yourself." His voice softened, and he reached for my hand again. This time, I didn't pull away. We sat there, hands clasped, the world outside his room fading to nothing. I told him about my past, about the man I'd loved and lost, about the years I'd spent hiding, pretending I didn't need anyone. He listened, his thumb tracing circles on my hand. And for the first time in years, I felt seen. But reality crept back in. A nurse knocked, breaking the moment, and I pulled away, my heart racing. Ethan was discharged the next day, his recovery strong enough to send him home. I should have been relieved, but all I felt was dread. He wasn't my patient anymore, but that only made the stakes higher. He left me his number, scrawled on a piece of paper with a single word, "Please." I stared at it for hours that night, my phone in one hand, whiskey in the other. I wanted to call, to hear his voice, to see where this could go. But every time I started to dial, I saw my career, my reputation, everything I'd built, flashing before my eyes. Days turned into a week. I threw myself into work, hoping distance would dull the ache. But then I saw him, Ethan, standing outside the hospital, waiting for me. He looked stronger, his cheeks flushed with life, but his eyes were the same, full of that reckless hope that terrified me. "You didn't call," he said, his voice steady but hurt. "I couldn't," I said, my throat tight. "Ethan, this isn't." "Don't," he interrupted, stepping closer. "Don't tell me what this isn't. Tell me what it is." And before I could stop him, he kissed me, right there in the parking lot, under the Seattle rain. It was quick, desperate, and it broke every wall I'd built. I pulled back, my heart pounding. "We can't do this here," I whispered, but I was already reaching for him again, my hands on his face, his warmth grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Then where?" he asked, his voice a challenge. And for the first time, I didn't have an answer. The rain soaked us both, but Ethan's kiss lingered hotter than the cold Seattle night. I drove us to my apartment, my hands shaking on the wheel, every rational thought screaming at me to turn back. But I didn't. He sat beside me, quiet but steady, his presence a gravity I couldn't escape. Inside, my apartment felt too small, too real. Ethan stood by the window, looking out at the city lights, his silhouette sharp against the glass. "Nice place," he said, but his voice was distant, like he was bracing for me to push him away again. I didn't. Instead, I crossed the room, my heart loud in my ears, and stood behind him. "Ethan," I started, but he turned, his eyes locking onto mine. "Don't say it," he said. "Don't tell me this is a mistake." He stepped closer, his hand finding mine, and I felt the last of my defenses crumble. We kissed again, slower this time, and it wasn't just need, it was trust. Fear. Everything we'd been holding back. We talked all night, sprawled on my couch, the city humming outside. He told me about his childhood, growing up in foster homes, always feeling like he didn't belong. I told him about my father, a man who'd never accept a son like me, and how I'd built my life around proving him wrong. It was raw, messy, and for the first time, I didn't feel alone. But morning brought reality crashing back. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "We need to talk. Now." My stomach dropped. I drove Ethan home, the silence between us heavy with unspoken questions. "This isn't over," he said as he got out, his eyes fierce. I nodded, but doubt was already creeping in. At the hospital, Sarah was waiting in my office, her expression grim. "People saw you, Mike, in the parking lot, with him." Her words were a gut punch. I tried to deny it, to play it off, but she wasn't buying it. "You're risking everything. You know that, right?" I did. But knowing didn't make it easier to let Ethan go. I spent the day on edge, dodging questions from colleagues, my mind replaying Sarah's warning. By evening, I was a wreck, but I couldn't stay away. I called Ethan, and he answered on the first ring. "Meet me," he said, his voice steady. "The pier. 1 hour." I shouldn't have gone, but I was already grabbing my keys. The pier was quiet, the water dark and endless. Ethan was there, leaning against the railing, his hoodie pulled tight against the wind. "You look like hell," he said, but his smile was warm, grounding. "I'm in trouble," I admitted, the words spilling out. "They know, Ethan, about us." His face fell, but he didn't back down. "Then let them know," he said, stepping closer. "I'm not ashamed of this. Are you?" His question cut deep, echoing the note he'd left me weeks ago. I wanted to say no, to be as brave as he was, but fear was a chain I'd worn too long. "I don't know how to do this," I said, my voice breaking. "I've spent my life hiding." He took my hand, his grip firm. "Then stop hiding. For once. Just live." And in that moment, under the stars and the weight of everything, I wanted to believe I could. But the hospital wasn't done with me. The next day, I was called into a meeting with the board. Rumors had spread, and they wanted answers. I stood there, my career hanging in the balance, and all I could think about was Ethan's hand in mine, his voice daring me to live. I didn't know if I was strong enough, but I knew I had to try. The boardroom was a cold, sterile cage. The hospital director's eyes boring into me like I was a specimen under a microscope. Dr. Harper, we've received reports of inappropriate conduct with a former patient, she said. Her voice clipped. My heart sank, but I kept my face neutral. Years of practice hiding my truth. I've done nothing wrong, I said, but the lie tasted bitter. I hadn't crossed any physical lines beyond that kiss. But my feelings for Ethan were a violation of every ethical code I'd sworn to uphold. The director didn't press for details she didn't need to. The rumors were enough to cast a shadow. You're suspended pending investigation, she said. Hand over your badge. The words were a punch, but I complied, my hands steady even as my world crumbled. I left the hospital in a daze, the rain soaking through my coat, Ethan's number burning in my pocket. I called him from my car, my voice shaking. They know, I said. I'm suspended. He was silent for a moment. Then, I'm coming over. Don't argue. I didn't. I needed him. And that terrified me more than the suspension. He showed up at my apartment, his hair damp from the rain, his eyes fierce with determination. This is my fault, he said, pacing my living room. I pushed you. I shouldn't have. Stop. I cut in, grabbing his shoulders. This isn't your fault. I chose this. I chose you. The words were out before I could stop them, and they hung between us, raw and true. Ethan's eyes softened, and he pulled me into a hug, his warmth anchoring me in the storm. We spent the night talking, planning, trying to find a way forward. He was young, fearless, ready to fight the world. I was older, scarred, but his courage was contagious. We can figure this out, he said, his hand in mine. You don't have to lose everything. But the next day brought a new blow. The hospital's investigation was escalating, and a reporter had caught wind of the story. My name was in an article. Vague but damning. Local doctor suspended amid allegations of patient misconduct. I read it on my phone, my stomach churning, while Ethan sat beside me, his face pale. They're twisting it, he said, his voice shaking with anger. They're making it sound like you took advantage of me. I know, I said, but the damage was done. My career, my reputation, everything I'd built was slipping away. And yet, with Ethan beside me, I felt a strange sense of freedom. For the first time, I wasn't hiding. We decided to fight back. I hired a lawyer, a sharp woman named Rachel who specialized in medical ethics cases. You've got a shot, she said, but it won't be easy. You need to be honest about everything. I nodded, but the thought of laying my life bare, of admitting I'd fallen for Ethan, made my chest tight. That night, Ethan stayed over again. We didn't talk about the case or the hospital. Instead, we cooked dinner, laughed, pretended the world wasn't closing in. As we lay on the couch, his head on my chest, I realized this was what I'd been missing, not just love, but the courage to claim it. But the fight was far from over. The hospital wanted a public apology, a clean break, and I wasn't sure I could give it. Ethan was worth it, but the cost was higher than I'd ever imagined. As I held him, I wondered if I was strong enough to lose everything for a chance at something real. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal meetings and sleepless nights. Ethan's hand in mine, the only thing keeping me grounded. The hospital's investigation dragged on, each day a new test of my resolve. Rachel, my lawyer, was relentless, digging into precedents, building a case that my suspension was based on rumors, not evidence. But the truth was, I wasn't just fighting for my job, I was fighting for the right to be myself. Ethan was my rock, his optimism a light in the dark. He'd started art school, his sketches filling my apartment with color and life. "You're gonna get through this," he'd say, his voice fierce with belief. I wanted to believe him, but the weight of the world, me colleagues' judgment, the media's scrutiny, my own doubts pressed hard. One night, as we sat on my balcony, the city sprawling below, he handed me a sketch. It was us 12 figures, hands clasped, standing against the stormy sky. "This is who we are," he said, "not what they say we are." I held the drawing, my throat tight, and knew I couldn't go back to the man I'd been hiding. Afraid. Alone. The hearing came faster than I expected. The boardroom was packed, hospital staff, lawyers, even a few reporters. I stood, my heart pounding, and told the truth. I admitted my feelings for Ethan, not as a patient, but as a man who'd changed my life. I didn't apologize for loving him, only for letting it blur the lines of my duty. The room was silent, the air thick with judgment. But Ethan was there, in the back, his eyes locked on mine, giving me strength. The board deliberated for days. When the verdict came, it was bittersweet. My suspension was lifted, but I was barred from patient care until I completed an ethics course. My career wasn't over, but it would never be the same. I didn't care. I'd found something worth more. Ethan and I moved forward, cautious but unafraid. We faced whispers, stares, but we faced them together. He graduated art school, his work gaining attention, while I took a teaching role at the hospital, mentoring young doctors. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was better, real, messy, alive. One evening, a year later, we walked the pier where we'd first dared to be honest. The stars were out, the water calm. Ethan stopped, pulling me close. "Worth it?" he asked, his voice soft but sure. I kissed him, the answer clear. Every second. We'd lost things, me old life, his innocence, the simplicity of before, but we'd gained more. Love, courage, a chance to live without hiding. Ethan's touch had crossed a line, but it had also set us free.